So, and now we move to questions. Sure. Yeah, so I think that there's been an effort to acknowledge that this is really going on, that it has always been part of the scholarly process to collaborate and communicate in the most efficient way possible. I don't think the Napster analogy is precisely right, because that's simply consuming. There really isn't, that was simply downloading music. It wasn't to look at a research paper and get a group of 20 or 10 scientists together to talk about it in hopes of new research, new science emerging from that discussion and other things that they were bringing together. So I think in spirit, it's better for us to not be inflammatory about this and to use language that recognizes the reality that we do want scientists to collaborate, that they are collaborating in new and different ways. They are using electronic networks to do that. But at the same time, we have to realize that we have an interest in having that usage counted. And that's really where our main interest lies. We just want credit for the fact that these papers are being used in new environments that are disassociated from the publisher's main hosting platform, that they have value in those areas, and so that we aren't hurt by the fact that this goes on. I think that's a fair answer.
I think maybe to add on a little bit to what you said, Kent, that big heat map slide that you had up there that showed that email is the primary way that people are sharing, right? I think these scholarly collaboration networks probably, if done right, have the potential to reduce that kind of email sharing. And email sharing has been going on for as long as email has been around. And, that was predated by photocopying and the pass-alongs, right? So I think the collaboration networks give us that opportunity to be able to capture the usage that is going on, could potentially reduce the email traffic, gives us better insight.
Kent, you mentioned the idea, I'm sorry, there was a question.
I know what you mean. So it wasn't used in my backyard, so I'm not paying for it, right? But I think it can be used indirectly to show that, you had this amount of usage, we had all this usage over here in these collaborative networks, and if we prorate that across our usage base, we're going to assign a certain amount to you, and it can also be just used to show, look at how valuable this content is to the community at large. You really need it. So I think it's better than not having it. So, but you're absolutely right. There's not a one-to-one relationship between your institution use this, at least not in all cases.
Yeah, go ahead. Question in the back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why it matters to every business model, because whether the subscription business model services authors, I would say, when it does it well, almost as much as an open access model. You want the best papers, you want the best authors, you want as many submissions as you can because you want to see what's going on. And authors are more interested in data. There are more sources of data they can pull together. So absolutely, if it's invisible to the publisher, it's going to be as invisible to the author. So absolutely.
And to build on that, it's also really important for research institutions that employ those authors. They want to know and be able to track and aggregate together the impact and reach of the research that is done on campus. Funders, similarly, are very interested. It benefits all stakeholders in the landscape.
Yeah, in the back on the right. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
One thing that I've noticed, I'm in publishing, and I noticed that recently, you remember the big e-book boom, people were publishing their nonfiction and fictional books on e-books, and people could download them on their tablets or whatever. Well, recently, they did a study, and the e-book boom has fizzled out pretty much. And I was just curious if you think that maybe with some of these e-journals and online journals or online exclusive journals, whatever, right now, do you think that there's going to come a time where those might plateau as well, or that boom will kind of just fizzle out just like the e-book craze did? Just out of curiosity.
I think the answer to that is no. I mean, journals have been online for more than 20 years now. And if you can't find something online, it might as well be dead. I did a PhD in the late 90s, and even back then, if I couldn't get to the full text in 1997, I had to have a stack of abstracts that was an inch tall before I was going to go to the library and photocopy a bunch of journal articles, right? So I think because science and research in general is so global, the electronic copy makes it so much easier for collaboration to happen that I just don't see a fizzling of the e-journal market.
Yeah, and I think the incentives matter. I think the reason, as somebody who published 3 ebooks, in addition to 3 little print books, I didn't get to be a millionaire along with the 10,000 or 100,000 other people by publishing my novels. So I think there was an incentive there to try to publish an ebook because the barrier to entry seemed lower. And the publishers had no real cost. They had some cost to do it, but it was worth trying. And it just didn't turn out to be a huge moneymaker for a huge number of people. The pressures in scholarly publishing are completely different. The reason more compelling than I've written 70,000 words and I'm hoping I can make $1 million. They publish it and they go, oh, that didn't work, and then they don't have another 70,000 words in them. So.
Thank you.
That question does point to a question that I had, which is I think that plateauing of ebooks is partly owing to the amount of interest people have in consuming book content in various form factors or formats. And in this case, there's a question about, are there ways to drive more users to come to consume journals content on your sites or things that you control and own and increase that value proposition, essentially as if it were a form factor, as opposed to going elsewhere and having a different type of an experience?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about the collaboration networks is, especially if they've got some sort of good library function, right? We've got all kinds of metadata about the information that a user has in their library. And boy, does that lead me to want to think hard about what kind of recommendation engine can I have. I mean, Amazon knows everything that I do probably better than I do, right? And they can recommend all kinds of products to me because they've got information about me. With a collaboration network, because I have compelled someone to log in and store things, I've got metadata about that person. I can recommend them. And I think that's a really great way to be able to drive consumers to my platform and to ingest more content.
Any other?
And there are lots of things publishers can do as well to enhance our offerings, and it's about integrating full text with data sets and visualizations and all of the related outputs that are compelling for the scientists. And whether we do that by linking or hosting, we'll figure that out. But the text doesn't stand in isolation anymore, and that's a good thing for all of these platforms.
Kent, you mentioned potentially having ways of using email more effectively. So I was curious about what that might be or where the improvements might lie.
Right. So I think that what I've seen over the past few years is, just simply publishing a list of content is not sufficient, especially if you don't have all of the various pieces in there to track back, who it is, what segment they come from, tie it in with your customer database, things like that. There really needs to be a rich, full circle email approach, and having more curated emails, having more thoughtful emails, having some mid-length content emails, and just even having an email strategy is something I think people need to think about. How are you going to, where does that fit in your entire acquisition strategy? How does that fit into your author acquisition strategy? It's something I've seen again and again people neglect or forget about or think it's solved because it's email and it's old school. But there's still a ton of power in there. And if you look, I would bet you that half the people checking their phones right now are looking at email. Am I right?
There must be some Facebook.
Or tweeting.
Candy Crush.
Yeah, Candy Crush.
I'm organizing with physics today. I want to start by touching on the issue of email. I mean, it goes back to product again. We changed our email designs over a year ago, and the number of people who opened it on a mobile device went up dramatically. The amount of people who were looking at the website jumped by over 150% on mobile. So I was wondering, Ken, whether one of the reasons why mobile doesn't seem to be an issue for science at the moment is because there isn't a good way for people to access science on a mobile device in terms of notifications. And then on the chart that you had, where you showed the green bar, the email going across and the red split, I noticed that there wasn't anything about news media. Yet science has got a fantastic press office that disseminates a lot of the papers in science into the media that way.
Right.
Is that because it's too hard to track, or is the number of people who come from newspaper sites or television sites
Right.
to physical science is a lot less?
Yeah, so two questions there. One is, our lack of mobile basically a self-fulfilling prophecy because we have a terrible mobile experience? Possibly. And so we're addressing that, and we'll see what happens. But even in surveys that we've done just generally, we see that our audience seems to be very laptop, desktop oriented, and very small amount of tablet usage just in their lives in general, or mobile phone for content acquisition at least. But we're gonna, it's normal. I mean, we have to change it because now Google has changed the rules. So if we're going to continue to be indexed well, we have to be very mobile savvy. So we're in the midst of changing that. The second question was, in my list of sources, we didn't talk about the news media. That's a separate report, but that tends to be through the direct navigation captured in that bucket in that chart. So,
Yes.
Is there something to be said about the quality of usage rather than just usage in general? I mean, because we had somebody who used an abstract who may or may not be in the field versus somebody who cites that article as part of their research. Those are very different types of usage, and they have very different values. What do you thoughts on that?
Yeah, I went to the researcher panel yesterday, which was pretty interesting, right? And the four people there talked about how they consume content. And so they're going to download a whole lot more abstracts than what they're really going to use. And it's really, the things that they're going to read in depth are going to be the things that they tend to cite in papers. So I think just because people are skimming abstracts or maybe looking at, some of the figures in a paper or skimming the conclusions, that's not maybe lesser quality, because I think it still helps to engage researchers' minds about what else might be possible. And that really hardcore usage of the previous literature is really reserved for a very small amount of content that people curate.
And I think that's absolutely right, that different sorts of usage and different measures of usage will be increasingly important. But that points up to a real challenge for our community. and for librarians and funders and other stakeholders as well. How do we come up with the standards for counting and sharing that information? We have Counter for hits on journal articles, but we essentially need that kind of approach, don't we, for sharing and aggregating cross-platform usage statistics and probably a richer array of usage as well.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole purpose of that red, yellow, green chart was qualitative. We had been talking internally about, look at all the traffic we're getting from Twitter and Facebook and whatnot, but then when we looked at it qualitatively, it's in and out traffic, it's transitory, they're not going deep, they're not staying on the site, they're not transacting with us, they're not engaged, they're finding something a little bit curious because where social media has pitched it, and what you have to do on social media, because you've got to have some clickbait in there. And so they click on it, they look at it, and they're gone. Now maybe after 1,000 encounters like that or some unknown number, they start to become a little bit more engaged. But when we look at the other sources, we can see that the engagement happens much more quickly, people stay on site much longer, they go to many more pages, and they transact with us. And so maybe that's where we put our effort, because that's ultimately where our core audience is.
I wanted to give, Alicia, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the new sharing policy from Elsevier.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
I was sort of enjoying today because I haven't had to talk about it this week. But let me put it in context, actually, in relationship to this panel. So your first two questions, Jonathan, were about which social collaboration networks are we trying to leverage and some of the benefits. And I guess from our perspective at the minute, we're being really promiscuous, if that's an acceptable word to use. We're trying to work with all of them. And we think they offer researchers a really terrific ability to collaborate and to communicate in a new way. And we don't know which ones, which researchers will find really compelling. But there are some challenges around that, and this is where I think the work done recently by STM to come up with sharing principles for commercial platforms has been really incredibly helpful. It's a really great start to try and think of what the rules of the road are to create a level playing field so published content can flow into those commercial platforms. And so one of the biggest drivers for our new sharing policies, we're actually trying then to work through how you put those sorts of principles into practice, because they're at a very high level, and it has lots of detailed implications for us that we need to continue thinking through. We haven't done a major policy change in 10 years. That's clearly too long. I would expect that we'll refresh this every year now going forward, because there are a lot of moving parts that we need to figure out. The other thing I would say about the sharing policy is we were beginning to start to think through, and this is a start, the difference between commercial sharing then, where the STM principles are helping to inform us, but what does non-commercial sharing, how does that work? What does it mean? What are the principles? And I do think that would be a huge area for potential collaboration with libraries and funders and other stakeholders. And even more challenging from a publishing perspective then, there's a huge, fuzzy, interesting space in between those worlds of commercial sharing and non-commercial sharing. So for example, if you have a single platform that has an area for an individual researcher to set up an author profile that they completely design and own and control, and that seems to me a little bit different than an area on the same platform that might aggregate content together from thousands or millions of researchers and might seek to monetize those in certain ways. And there'll be bleed through in different sorts of interconnectivity between those two types of functionality on the same platform. Okay, we haven't even begun to go there yet, but it just shows how kind of rich and complex and important it is to engage in this area.
So, I mean, I don't know if publishers are doing this, but if you were to set up an area for an author, give them a certain number of access tokens that they could share with colleagues that they want to collaborate with and that they want to share their work with. I don't know what the number would be, 15, 20, 50. But do you think that would somehow take some of the air out of the heated debate around where we draw this line or drawing lines at all about what sharing is okay and what is not okay?
Yeah, and that's a feature of the STM principles, which Sarah's worked on very directly. Okay. It introduces new concepts to address Phil's point about publishers inventing new vocabulary. I guess we are, because we're grappling with new and changing issues. The STM principles introduce ideas like the difference between private sharing, whether that's with an individual colleague or in a group of collaborators, and public sharing, which is anything that's kind of visible to everybody on the planet. And again, that gives us some complexity to work through as publishers, but it's important, I think, that we are disciplined enough to start thinking through and articulating how we're going to deal with that complexity. It's important to signal to authors that they can participate in those kinds of groups, I think, at least.
And maybe there are ways that are more responsible and trackable rather than just going into the dark, basically, by emailing around PDFs.
Yeah, but I think we have to be realistic. We've tried, back in DRM days and things like that, publishers tried to issue tokens and tried to do, refer-based linking and all this, and authors would just go, downloading the PDF, emailing it, goodbye. So it's so easy to work around, and it's so natural. We have to acknowledge their natural workflow, and we don't want to get in the way of that, because we don't want to be an impediment to scientific progress because of our, eagerness to count one usage.
Do you think that if you put a tracker in the PDFs that you publish and acknowledge that publicly, that people would try to defeat that, or that authors would say, well, that's very convenient for me? You're going to measure the PDF and its movement and who's using it, and that's a reasonable approach?
So I'm not sure about trackers, because that sounds awfully
well, you can embed a clear image file into it.
Yeah, we are talking and have made a commitment to start tagging content in a new way. And one of the things that we've been hearing from social collaboration networks and repositories is that if publishers would tag especially accepted manuscripts from the point of acceptance with a few key bits of metadata, the DOI particularly, and a label about what version of the article that is, then it would give them important metadata that they need when they ingest full text into their platform or into their repository. So they can figure out, first of all, which publisher is associated with this article, and then they can figure out what are the relevant policies or approaches that they need to be mindful of, and then they can differentiate what they can do with an accepted manuscript versus an article in press or a published journal article, whatever the publisher's rules are. At the minute, they don't have any hope. What they have is a tsunami of user-uploaded content, and they know that we have an interest in how that's used, but they need our help to be able to operate on that content in an automated way. So I think we could do ourselves a real service as a community in thinking perhaps about standards in that area. So it's a way of labeling content, but not in a hidden way.
Right, in a very visible
way.
Yeah, and I think there are possibilities. I remember working on something like this back in days when I could remember things. But at one point I think we worked on a project to put something in each PDF that would be basically checked to see if there have been any corrections, retractions, or anything about this article. And then you just would link out from the PDF and go to a landing page, and then you could sign up for alerts to see if there are anything. So it becomes part of the workflow. It's not intrusive. It's actually viewed as a service. And you start to get feedback about what the PDF environment is like. So I think there is a way to make this fit with workflow and natural caution that people will have about encapsulated articles. Make them network again.
Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit more about the principles? Because I want to make sure we get to that as well. Is there anything we didn't cover that's important conceptually?
Thank you. I'm sure I agree with. Yeah, I think that I encourage you all to go to the STM website and go look at the principles which were released for consultation in February. We had about 50 different people or organizations comment on those principles, and that task force is taking the feedback and refining the principles to better reflect, I think, the needs of the community. The principles were really around, we want to ensure that we can facilitate collaboration among researchers, among academic researchers, scholarly researchers. We sort of debate about that language a little bit, in private groups, and really do encourage the sharing widely of metadata about articles, but recognizing the value of the PDF and the full content. As Alicia mentioned, a pilot to tag content a little bit better so that the SCNs know better about what is allowed to be done with what particular version of the article is available. And then also to look at how we can make that usage out of the scientific collaboration networks counter-compliant. So I think Elsevier is looking at a pilot around that, right?
Are there more questions? Toby.
No, the shareable files.
Yeah, the read-only files.
We just had the payoff moment.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank
Toby.
We can probably squeeze in one last question before we wrap up. Anything? Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and I'd like to thank the panelists. I think it was a really good conversation. Thank you.